Hello everybody, here is your study guide key. Alright, so when we're talking about ecology, we're going to talk through the levels of ecology from smallest to largest. Remember, you can remember it as old people can eat banana bread. O is for organism, one individual living thing. P is for population, a group of the same living things, same species. Community is the third one. That would be fish and weeds and snails, multiple species living in the same location. E stands for ecosystem. We're going to add together all of those different living species in the same location, but we're also going to add in non-living things like the weather, the clouds, the water temperature, rocks surrounding the shore of that pond, etc. A biome is a group of ecosystems that are all similar, with similar organisms, similar climate, and so in the case of a pond, we would call that a freshwater pond biome. Biosphere is the entire surface of the Earth. That's my version of the Earth. The entire surface of the Earth that supports life. So when we talk about the difference between autotrophs and heterotrophs are self-feeding. They're also known as producers. They include anything that does photosynthesis, like a plant or an algae. Heterotrophs are things that don't feed themselves, so they have to eat something else, and that would be all of our animals. They're also known as consumers. The difference between habitat and niche is that habitat is where you live, and your niche is your role in that environment. So whether you're a decomposer or your job is to work with dead things, etc. So primary succession is when you start over from scratch and there is no soil. So this is what would happen after a volcanic eruption or if you have bare rock exposed by a landslide or an earthquake. Secondary succession means you start a new community within an existing community after there's been some sort of small disturbance, like there's a fire or a flood that washes away things, or even just a tree falling down in the forest that allows new things to start growing in that environment that still had soil and seeds available. Producers are here in green. These are your autotrophs, the things that use photosynthesis. They're the basis of every food chain or food web. The things that eat them are known as your primary consumers. They're the first things that would eat plants. After them come your secondary consumers. They're the things that eat plants. And then you're going to have your tertiary consumers next. Those are the top of the food chain. They eat the other consumers. So what happens to the energy as you move up a food web or up a food chain? Only some of that energy gets transferred. Other is lost as heat, and other energy is lost through other means. So we consider that we lose 10% every time. And that tells us why there aren't that many high-level consumers, because there's less energy available to them. And you can never have the number of consumers outnumber the producers because they would starve to death. There wouldn't be enough food available for them. So if we look at our food web and just the circled section that starts with 1,400 joules, we know that we're losing 10% with each step. So knock off a 0, and that would tell you that there's 140 calories available to the lizard, and therefore only 14 calories available to the hawk. The water cycle is not going to be covered heavily on this test, but here are some vocab words that you should know. Transpiration, I want you to think about perspiration. It's how plants sweat, just like perspiration is how we sweat. It's how they release water up into the atmosphere through their pores of their leaves. Percolation is how water dissolves through the layers of soil back into the ground to be stored in aquifers and other ground storage. This is a way of putting water back down into the ground. Condensation is how water vapor up in the atmosphere starts to fall down as rain, snow, fog, sleet, ice, etc. And once again, this is a way that water moves down back into the earth. And then evaporation is how water goes from a liquid up to a gas or a vapor, and that is how we form clouds, that is how puddles disappear, and that is sending water back up into the atmosphere. All right, next up is the nitrogen cycle. You guys should really focus on the nitrogen cycle because it's pretty confusing. So with nitrogen fixation, this is how we capture gases of nitrogen out of the air and make them into a form that plants can actually use. There are a bunch of ways that we can do that. We can do that through lightning strikes, through chemical fertilizers, or through soil bacteria. The next phase is with nitrogen use and nitrogen uptake. During that phase, we're simply letting things use that nitrogen to make proteins, whether plants are making proteins or animals are making proteins. Bacteria are so important for every one of these steps. So once again, all of this in green is going to be nitrogen fixation. Bacteria are involved there. And then the next stage is nitrogen uptake, so that's anything involving plants and animals growing and using nitrogen. And then denitrification is when we're done with it and we're sending it back up into the atmosphere. Bacteria are involved in the first and last stages. With the carbon cycle, we have sources that send carbon up and sinks that bring carbon back down into our Earth for storage. They're all highlighted for you on the diagram, so things like burning fossil fuels, gassy cows, those are sources, and then sinks would be photosynthesis or dissolving it into the ocean. We've seriously messed up the carbon cycle in a lot of ways. We've put a ton of extra carbon up into the atmosphere, and then we've also limited the ways that carbon can be brought down through deforestation. So why should we care? Lots of reasons. Number one is climate change, because carbon is a greenhouse gas. It affects the warming of the earth. We are also causing many species to go extinct or become endangered because of habitat loss. And then the last thing is that we have melting sea ice, which is going to change the surface and borders of all of our continents. The oceans are becoming acidic. And then we also have that crazy thing happening with poison ivy. With population growth, there are two patterns to know. The first one is exponential growth, which is where it rises and doesn't really stop. It never reaches a limit. And we've had very few cases of that except with human population growth. Logistic growth is seen more often. It rises until it reaches some sort of natural limit, which we know as the carrying capacity. There's something that is going to be in that environment that says, nope, you're too big, now it's time to starve to death. Or, nope, you're too big, it's too crowded, you've run out of fresh water. So that dotted red line is the carrying capacity. It is the limit that the environment can support sustainably forever and ever. Humans have grown exponentially, like I said, and we see that on population growth pyramids. If it is getting wider at the bottom, that indicates rapid growth. Every generation is getting bigger. And then if it is an inverted triangle, we see that that would be negative growth. Every generation is getting fewer and fewer people. And then America is one example of pretty stable growth. We might have some fluctuations year to year, but in general, the sides, left and right sides, are pretty even over the course of history. Density-dependent factors that limit population or would limit the carrying capacity of an ecosystem are things that matter more when it starts to get crowded. These are usually biotic things. So for example, in class we talked about the fact that as the deer population got more and more crowded, they used up all the food that was available, and then they started to starve and the population fell back down again. So we've got our food supply. You could also talk about the fact that parasites become more common as soon as you get a crowded area and diseases become more common. If it is density independent, it doesn't matter how crowded it gets. These are things that are going to act on the population and limit its size or knock it back down to a lower population number. It doesn't matter if it's crowded. We tend to think of these as our abiotic factors or non-living factors. They would be things like a flood or a fire or a hurricane or a tornado. They are going to strike an area whether it has 500,000 frogs in it or if it's only got 50 frogs in it. It's going to happen either way. Next up, we're going to talk about symbiotic relationships. This is way back at the start of the unit. If you have a positive relationship, it is mutualism. It is mutually beneficial for both species involved. If you have a positive-negative interaction, you could have two options. The first option would be predation, and then the second positive-negative interaction would be parasitism. We'll talk about the differences between those two in just a second. The next one is if it is positive-neutral. That interaction is called commensalism. And then the last one is negative-negative, and that is competition. So let's give some examples. Mutualism would be you and your dog. You are both mutually getting a benefit because you get a stress reliever through your dog, and your dog gets a free bowl full of kibble every day and a free place to stay. He gets a home. Predation would be your dog eating a rabbit, for example. I had to think of an animal that we wouldn't feel so bad if your dog ate it. But if your dog eats the rabbit, it's good for your dog because he got some calories, he got some food. Bad for the rabbit because now he's dead. Parasitism is slightly different because that would be like the case of a tapeworm and your dog. The tapeworm is stealing nourishment or stealing blood or stealing food out of the host, but it's not actually eating the host. It's not killing the host in the process. That's the major difference between predation and parasitism. Commensalism would be like a bird building its nest in a tree. The bird gets a benefit because it has a safe place to land. The tree really doesn't even notice that the bird is there. The last case would be competition. That would be like your dog and your cat both competing over space on the couch or competing over the food dish or the water dish or your attention, anything like that. There's not enough to go around, so they both have to fight and waste resources, waste energy to try and maximize what they can get out of that competitive relationship. Negative-negative. So animal species and plant species, we're going to talk just about the ones in Minnesota first. So Asian carp are a nasty fish that live in Minnesota. They dig up the lake bottom, they eat everything, and they can also fly up out of the air and hit you in the face, which is not cool. So those are both in Minnesota. Sea lampreys eat other fish. Zebra mussels are choking our waterways, and that's not good either. As far as plants, in the water we have something called Eurasian milfoil, which is choking out our other plant species and making lakes really murky and gross. We have buckthorn that is out in the woods, and then we have this thing called poison hemlock, which is originally a garden plant, but here it's very poisonous and toxic to humans to eat, so that's why it's invasive. We also have the example of cane toads in Australia. Please don't confuse that. They are not in Minnesota, but you guys have a lot of information on cane toads. So biomagnification is something that we have directly affected our ecosystems with. When we put toxins into our atmosphere or into our ecosystems, they build up and they get worse and worse and worse over each step of the food chain. So when you get to your higher level consumers, when you get to tertiary and secondary consumers, they are adding up all of that toxin that they've been exposed to in lower organisms, and that causes them to get really, really sick. So good luck to you guys on the test. If there's anything else I can do to help you study for this test, please just shoot me an email and I'd be glad to help.